Welcome to this week's episode of Safety Brainiacs. Today we're talking about another fundamental element of your safety management system, and that's hazard assessment. Hazard assessment is something that applies across all industries, and so today we're going to give our best tips for that to be made effective. First off, let's talk about what are some of the successful elements before you even begin hazard assessment. So a good idea is to have some awareness and some training in hazard identification and control. I found through my experience that hazard identification is really learned. People can look at, say, for example, a grinder and maybe not know to look that the wheel is actually rated correctly for the grinder that it's on. I mean, that takes education, that's training. Number two, having both supervisors and workers involved in the hazard assessment process is also very critical. Another critical element of hazard assessment is coming at it with fresh eyes every day. Where does hazard assessment fail? Well, one of the big areas it fails is the opposite of what I just talked about, is when there's complacency and people approach their hazard assessment as if it's the same old as yesterday, and they don't actually come at it with fresh eyes. It fails if you don't have worker involvement, if you don't have proper training in hazard assessment and control, and it also fails if you don't review your hazard assessments from time to time. So after we've identified the hazards, then the next thing we have to do is rank them or assess them. The reason why we want to do that is if we've identified 10 hazards, we may not have the capacity and the resource to control all of them. So which are the ones that are in the most urgent need of controls? And we do that through our risk ranking matrix. And typically, risk is a function of probability times severity. So severity is the consequence of the injury or loss, while probability is the likelihood of the event actually occurring. And risk is the expected loss in relation to the likelihood and the severity of the harm. So here's some key tips when you are doing your risk assessment. Number one, you always assess for worst credible severity. And when in doubt, you scale your severity up. So if you're not sure if it would be a sprained ankle or a broken ankle, for example, which one are you going to pick? You're going to pick the broken ankle if you're not sure. Or if you're in a group and you can't agree, you scale your severity up. On that note, understand that worst credible risk does not mean worst conceivable. So it's not the worst you could possibly imagine, but what's the worst credible risk given the circumstances? And note that your risk assessment is not a substitute for complying with your local regulations and standards, right? So the regulation and standard is the minimum best practice. You must follow that. So when you're looking at severity, there are some things you want to be considering. Number one, how many people could be hurt? Obviously, if 5 people could be injured versus 1, even though 1's very important, but if 5 could be injured, you're going to scale your severity up. How well your controls and monitoring is working at the present time. So let's say, for example, you're working at heights and it's a flat surface, but you have a really good guardrail system and people are trained to stay even 6 feet away from the guardrail. That's a current control and monitoring system that seems to already be working. So you're going to factor that into your severity assessment. Also, how quickly the danger could arise. So if there is some hazard, are people going to have warning? Or is there going to be something like carbon monoxide where there is no warning? You can't smell it, you can't know that it's happening. And the work environment itself. So is the work environment maybe cluttered and people can't move quickly if they need to? So you need to consider that. You want to look at near misses. That could have been much more serious in the past. And you also want to look at the tools and materials being used. When it comes to probability, there's also some factors you want to be considering. So the likelihood of the hazard actually causing harm. So if I fall 4 feet to a grassy surface, what's the likelihood of me actually being hurt? Versus if I fall 6 feet to a concrete surface, what's the likelihood of me actually being injured? You can look at the frequency of exposure to the hazard when it comes to probability, like how often are we exposed to this hazard throughout the day does certainly impact the probability of it happening. You want to also be looking at how well your current controls are working. You want to look at the experience of the workers involved. Are they new workers with limited experience? Are they really experienced workers who are complacent? Are they really experienced workers that are really on the ball? So those are some of the things that you want to consider. And typically you'll have a hazard ranking matrix and you will select a number, typically between 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 for severity as well as for your probability, and you rank your hazards accordingly. So that's a quick little overview of risk assessment. Never underestimate the power of good risk assessment. Every time we're called to a serious incident or a serious near miss, it often goes back to people missing things on a risk assessment or getting a little complacent. So that's this week's episode of Safety Brainiacs. Remember, a Brainiac is an exceptionally intelligent person, so go out there, do great risk assessment so that you all go home safe at the end of the workday and your business is protected. If you like these video safety talks, please click the subscribe button, share with your friends, and we'll see you next week.